I mean, you've been there, and it's the fog. I won't say of war. It's not a war, but some sort of fog inside the government. But does this seem a little foggier than usual? Because a lot of us are awfully confused about what's going on.
Well, there's a lot of legitimate confusion right now, that's for sure. This is a tense and unpredictable time as we try to deal with just exactly what is the threat that we're facing. Obviously, we know that China has deployed these balloons, not just here, but everywhere in the world. The purpose of those balloons is clearly surveillance, intelligence gathering, and that obviously represents a threat to our country. And I'm glad we took steps to shoot that down. Now, with regards to these other objects, I think it's very important to determine exactly what we're dealing with. Uh, we don't know whether they're surveillance. We don't know whether they belong to China. There's a lot of unknowns here, and we've got to find out the facts. And then we have to develop a strategy for exactly how are we going to deal with these various objects that we're detecting at this point in time. We've got to have a strategy. I think if they are related to China, all of them, then we've got to develop that strategy, hopefully in conjunction with China. If not, we're going to have to continue to shoot them down if they represent a threat to the United States or to our airspace.
So, as you suggest, we believe that that first balloon was from China. We just don't know about these other objects, which were much smaller, as I understand, the size of small automobiles, I'm told. But beyond the possibility of surveillance purposes, is there also a possible purpose of really testing our air defenses to see how alert we are, whether we can recognize these things quickly and act on them? And if so, how are we holding up?
Well, I think our defenses are pretty good with regards to identifying these objects. Obviously, they've now ratcheted down our radar to be able to pick up smaller objects, and for that reason, that's why we're able to spot these particular objects. Uh, there could be several reasons here. It's hard to get into the mind of China if they are associated with China. But part of it could be surveillance. I mean, we don't know for sure whether or not surveillance is part of these other objects. The other thing is that China may very well be harassing us with these objects to try to create the kind of confusion that's taking place in Washington right now as to how we deal with it. China is pretty good at trying to undermine our confidence in some way, and that's exactly what I think they're trying to do with these various objects. That's why it's important to be able to determine just exactly what we're dealing with and then develop a comprehensive strategy to be able to deal with those situations so that we do not have a period of high unpredictability where we just are reacting on a crisis by crisis basis.
Mr. Secretary, let's go to a different topic that you and I have talked about a fair amount. That's Ukraine and what's happening there. Everyone seems to agree again that Russia is about to have a major offensive, if it hasn't already begun over there. How are the Ukrainians positioned? Because there's a lot of concern, particularly I've seen reports in the press about ammunition and possibly running out of ammunition and that we won't be able to supply it fast enough.
Well, there's no question we've had a lot of advance notice here and intelligence that indicates that Russia is indeed going to conduct an offensive and that offensive may very well have already begun. That was the news from NATO yesterday. And if that's the case, it is absolutely essential that Ukraine be fully prepared to deal with that kind of offensive. There is right now, I think, a time delay in trying to get the weapons that they need to them. The tanks are going to take a while. Other weapons are taking a while. There are clearly problems with shortages in ammunition that have to be dealt with. I think this is a crisis moment where the United States and NATO and the Ukraine have to come together and try to expedite assistance to the Ukrainians so that they are fully prepared to be able to deal with an offensive. They've got the momentum in this war, and they can't lose that momentum. 2023, I think, is going to be a very decisive year with regards to this war, and it'll tell us whether or not we are able, working with Ukraine, to stop Putin and to, in essence, prevent him from achieving his goals. That is going to be the key to whether or not we are successful with this effort in Ukraine. We've got to be. It represents a challenge to not only their democracy, but to every democracy.
Mr. Secretary, there's no question, at least in my mind, that the Biden administration is really committed to this. At the same time, there was a report in the Washington Post, and I'm attributed to the Washington Post, I don't know if it's right or not, that U.S. officials right now are telling Ukrainians that they face I'm going to read this, critical moment to change the trajectory of the war, raising the pressure on Kyiv to make significant gains in the battlefield. Does that make sense? I thought that they were trying to fight as hard as they could. I mean, what can they do? Run faster?
Uh, I I think, like everything else, a lot depends on how the Ukrainians target their forces and where they target their forces. If they're able to target their forces in a way that can stop any offensive by Russia, and indeed push back so that Russia begins to fall back from the territories that they've gained, I think that's the most important goal right now, is to show that Ukraine can not only defend their country, but can move the Russians out of the territory that they were able to gain over this last year in the war. If they can do that, then they force Putin to make one of two decisions: either to face defeat on the battlefield, or to decide that he's going to try to negotiate. That ought to be the goal of both the United States, NATO, and the Ukraine in these next few months as they confront the Russians.
Very helpful, Mr. Secretary, I must say. Let me ask about one other area that's been geopolitically very important in the United States, and that is Israel, the Middle East. Because obviously, Mr. Netanyahu is back in as prime minister, and it's not his first go around at that, as you know. I think you met him first when you were chief of staff for President Clinton. But there's a lot of controversy going on around his administration right now with the reform of the judiciary. He's got a lot of civil unrest. What is the risk to the U.S. Geopolitical position if Israel goes wobbly?
Well, it's of concern because obviously we have a very close bond with Israel. It's based on the fact that they are the only democracy in that part of the world, and we've always supported that democracy. And if indeed they start to take steps that undermine their democracy, and clearly one of those steps is if they try to somehow undermine the system of checks and balances. I think one of the most important things in a democracy is our system of checks and balances, where we have an executive, a legislative, and judicial branch. Each can be a check on the other in terms of limiting power. If they make a move that undermines the ability of the judiciary to be able to perform that role, they undermine their democracy. So this is a very critical time in which I think the United States has to make clear that Israel has to remain the most important democracy in the Middle East, and that to remain the most important democracy, they have to support the institutions that are critical to democracy.